Zoom outage, what happened and what we learned, a DevOps Postmortem. It's Monday morning, August 24, 2020. For most people in North America and Europe, it's the start of a new work week, the time when the world is supposed to log on and connect. But instead of seeing faces on screens, thousands of users are staring at spinning icons and failed to join errors. By the time down detector started spiking before 8:00 a.m. ET, the scale was already becoming clear. This wasn't just a glitch, it was a total blackout of the primary tool for global communication. Schools were silenced, businesses ground to a halt, and the digital town square went dark. Somewhere in the sprawling infrastructure of Zoom's network, a single catastrophic domino had fallen, triggering a cascading failure that would paralyze millions of users. The sheer magnitude of the silence was deafening. We didn't know it yet, but one small configuration change was about to become a global headline. Picture this. It's the height of 2020, and for millions of people across the globe, Zoom isn't just an app, it is the literal lifeline for remote work, education, and human connection. It was the digital town square. So, when things started to buckle on the morning of August 24, 2020, it wasn't just a minor bug, it was a massive infrastructure failure. By shortly before 8:00 a.m. ET, reports began flooding in as users across North America and Europe found themselves staring at spinning icons, instead of joining webinars or starting meetings. This wasn't some obscure niche service failing. This was a core piece of global infrastructure grinding to a halt. For the engineers on the front lines, the stakes were immediate and visible. They weren't just fighting a bug in the code, they were trying to keep the world's meetings running when the very pipes delivering those connections began to collapse. It was Monday, August 24, 2020. For most of the world, Zoom had become the backbone of daily life, the digital stage for schools, businesses, and global meetings. Everything seemed stable until the early hours of that morning, before 8 a.m. ET, the first ripples appeared as reports began to spike on down detector. It started as a localized tremor in the infrastructure, but it was about to become a landslide. The catalyst wasn't a massive surge in users or a sophisticated cyber attack. It was something much more mundane and, in hindsight, far more dangerous. A routine configuration change was pushed to a network router. The goal was simple: manage traffic routing from a specific data center. It was supposed to be a surgical adjustment to keep the gears turning, but instead, that single change set off a cascading failure across the entire Zoom infrastructure. It started like any other Monday morning, but by just before 8 a.m. ET on August 24, 2020, the digital ground began to shake. The first tremors weren't internal alerts, they were the frantic pings from down detector as reports of connectivity issues spiked across the map. By the time the sun was up, the situation had metastasized into a full-blown global service disruption. For users across North America and parts of Europe, the join button became a dead end, and webinars simply wouldn't start. It wasn't just a glitch, it was a wall. Engineers were suddenly staring at a fractured infrastructure where the ability to host meetings had vanished almost instantly. What looked like a localized hiccup quickly revealed itself as a systemic failure of the core service, leaving thousands of schools and businesses silenced in a desperate search for a connection that wouldn't come. It started with a single, misguided tweak to a network router. The goal was simple: manage traffic routing from one specific data center. But in the world of high-scale infrastructure, specific can quickly turn into everything. That configuration change didn't just trip a local switch. It triggered a cascade that rippled across the entire Zoom infrastructure. By the time reports started spiking on down detector before 8 a.m. ET on August 24, 2020, the rot was already spreading. It wasn't just one region, it was a global service disruption. Users across North America and parts of Europe suddenly found themselves locked out of meetings and webinars. What should have been a localized adjustment became a systemic failure, paralyzing the platform's ability to host even basic connections. The infrastructure didn't just hiccup, it buckled under the weight of its own interconnected dependencies until the very core of the service was unreachable for thousands. So, what actually broke the machine? It wasn't a massive DDoS attack or a sudden spike in user demand. It was something much more insidious, a single configuration change to a network router. The engineers were trying to tweak traffic routing for one specific data center, but that tiny adjustment had a catastrophic ripple effect. Instead of isolating the change, it hit a broader range of services, creating a cascading failure across the entire Zoom infrastructure. By the time reports started spiking on Down Detector before 8:10 a.m. ET on August 24, 2020, the damage was spreading globally. This wasn't just a local hiccup, it became a systemic collapse where a localized configuration error poisoned the wider network. It's the classic butterfly effect of infrastructure one misplaced line of config in one router and suddenly, thousands of users across North America and Europe couldn't join their meetings. It was a brutal reminder of how fragile interconnected systems can be. Imagine the chaos of a global platform just grinding to a halt. On the morning of August 24, 2020, the blast radius wasn't just some minor glitch. It was a full-scale blackout for users across North America and parts of Europe. People couldn't start meetings or join webinars, effectively silencing thousands of schools and businesses that had come to rely on Zoom as critical infrastructure. The silence started early, with reports spiking before 8:00 a.m. ET. By the time engineers were scrambling to find the source at 9:50 a.m. ET, the impact was already widespread. While the fix was finally rolling out after 11 a.m. ET, the damage was done for those trying to get through their morning schedules. It wasn't just a few dropped packets. It was a massive service disruption that paralyzed communication for a significant portion of the global user base for several hours. The alarms started screaming before 8:08 a.m. ET on August 24, 2020, as Down Detector began showing a massive spike in reports. It wasn't just a few glitchy meetings, it was a full-scale global service disruption hitting North America and Europe. The engineering team had to dive into the chaos of users unable to start or join webinars while the pressure mounted. By 9:50 a.m. ET, they finally pinned down the culprit, a single configuration change to a network router. This one move, intended only for specific data center traffic routing, had triggered a catastrophic cascading effect across the entire infrastructure. The battle was intense but focused. They moved to isolate and revert that specific misconfiguration, and by 11 a.m. ET, they were pushing out a fix. Within just a few hours of the initial spike, the system stabilized and service was restored for the vast majority of users. By 9:50 a.m. ET on August 24, 2020, the team finally pinned the ghost in the machine to a single, botched configuration change on a network router. It was supposed to be a surgical tweak for traffic routing at one specific data center, but instead it triggered a cascading failure across the entire infrastructure. The fix was a classic undo button move. Engineers identified the misconfigured router and reverted that specific change to stabilize the system. By 11 a.m. ET, they were pushing out fixes to restore service for those stranded in North America and Europe. To make sure this particular nightmare didn't become a recurring theme, Zoom overhauled their internal testing protocols for configuration changes. They tightened up monitoring to catch localized blips before they go global and bake it in much stricter rollback procedures for any critical infrastructure updates. It was a hard-won lesson in the dangers of just one small change. Look, we've all been there, that gut-wrenching moment when a single configuration change on a network router turns into a global catastrophe. The Zoom team learned the hard way that local changes don't stay local when your infrastructure is this massive. By August 24, 2020, it was clear their internal testing for configuration updates wasn't deep enough to catch how one misstep could trigger such a cascading failure across North America and Europe. The real takeaway here isn't just be more careful. It's about building ironclad safeguards. They needed better monitoring to catch the blast radius of localized changes before they hit the entire user base, and much faster rollback procedures for critical infrastructure. When you're running a service that millions rely on every morning, you can't afford to let one router config turn into a headline. You have to automate the safety nets so that even when a human makes a mistake, the system catches them before it breaks. That's how Zoom Video Communications, Inc. turned a very bad day into a lesson. If this saved you an outage, subscribe for the next postmortem.